of a shot of winning. We can beat anybody in the world, and I think we're going to win next Sunday.
And welcome back to the New York Jets Atlantic Flight Podcast. I'm your host, Gus, and with me, very special guest in America, is Dylan Tereman. How you doing, Dylan?
I'm doing well. This is second time on in just a few short months, so very happy to be back speaking with you. I have you exclusively all to myself today for this conversation, so I'm equally as happy. So glad to see you. I know it's a little later on your Sunday, but it's noon here, and we got a good slate of football games after a pretty good slate last night too.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It is the story of what happened, particularly if you're a Jets fan, of what happened in Detroit last night. I don't think anybody saw this coming. We did a pod last night, and all of us had the Lions winning comfortably against the Commanders. Did anybody back the Commanders? I'm assuming Commanders fans did, but did anybody back the Commanders to win 45-31? The obvious chatter is it's been on Twitter, and we know how this goes. Buffalo Jet does these lovely little polls, which I absolutely find hilarious. Before something happens, he'll do a poll. What's your opinion of this? And people will vote in a particular way. And then after the event's happened, he'll put another poll up, exactly the same. What's your opinion of the same
hmm
thing? And it goes completely to the opposite way because it didn't go the way that they liked. So this is pretty much what's happened on Jets Twitter at the moment. So pre the game last night, you couldn't fall over yourself for finding tweets wanting Aaron Glenn as the next head coach of the New York Jets, and now you log on today and it's gone the other way. So
hmm
there are plenty of people on there saying, well, this is another Robert Saleh. He didn't make any in-game adjustments, and
hmm
a lot of the facts have just been completely ignored. And what you're actually looking for in a head coach, we're not actually looking for a defensive coordinator. We're not looking for an offensive coordinator. We're looking for a leader. And he is one of the favourites, rightly so, to be the next head coach of the New York Jets. But I know you and we didn't actually watch a lot of the game live, but we have enough bare bones to be able to talk about this. So what did you gather from the game last night, the loss the Lions had against the Commanders?
Yeah, it felt like a game where offensively, first, the Lions got a little too cute. Ben Johnson did some things that put their offense in danger and caused Jared Goff to, turn the ball over multiple times. I think he had three interceptions and they had four or five total on the day. But defensively, where it comes in from Aaron Glenn's perspective, and then also the Jets' perspective, is with what he had to work with, it was kind of what you would expect based on the names that were out on the field, but it's still a playoff game where you're the number one seed. I did see a little bit of adjustments first half to second half in terms of like more blitzing, in terms of like less man in the first half. So little tidbits that I was picking up just in what I was seeing intermittently. But it's not a good look. That being said, you can't base everything on one game. So the discourse around Aaron Glenn this morning, whether it's negative or positive, I feel like isn't healthy or like, you know, in good faith. Because if you liked Aaron Glenn, and he was your number one guy no matter what, then you're going to dismiss it and you're going to say the injuries are a big contributing factor. And you're just going to, wipe the slate clean. He's going to be our coach. And like you said, he's not a defensive coach. He's just a coach and all good things like that. But you still have to look into it that like it was not a good game and bad games are going to happen. His defense schematically isn't like what I think of like a Brian Flores, but I would still put Aaron Glenn up there on my list. I'm not going to use one game negatively or positively. Although last week when the Rams got after the Vikings on both sides of the ball, I was told that Brian Flores is less qualified to be a head coaching candidate now because his defense didn't do well. So I'm not into the one game reactionary stuff. Both the Vikings and the Detroit Lions were 15 win, 14 win teams. So I'm not going to turn my nose up to their coordinators after one or two bad performances on the totality of the season is good. So Aaron Glenn still remains probably my number one guy. But it's not like it's his job to lose, in my opinion. There's the allure of Joe Brady and the allure of Josh McCown being offensive guys that make it, that much more intriguing to me than a defensive, hypothetically, guy like Aaron Glenn or Brian Flores. But Glenn, to me, is still a top candidate for the job, and it seems like he's the front runner. So I'm not gonna, I don't know, like, I don't know, put my shield up and stand in front of him and say, I'm going to take the bullets for you because you're not our coach at the end of the day. But like, I'm not going to not support him if he does become the Jets coach. So it's a weird position to be in this morning, but I'm not going to pick a negative or positive spin on it because of one performance. I like him as a coach. His offensive staff is a question mark, and we don't know what any of these staffs are going to look like for the coaches. So it's
Mm.
wait and see, but I do think Aaron Glenn is still qualified to be a head coach.
Do you think he's actually at this moment in time? I mean, we know what he's done in the past. We know that he's worked with Bill Parcells, obviously as a
Hmm.
player and as a scout as well. He's risen up through the ranks. He's taken an awful long time to get to where he's got. So he's a student of the game. He knows what he's talking about. And I think it's quite clear when you see how the Detroit Lions defense, especially, and I'm just saying the defense because I think he's actually got a huge amount of respect in the entire team, not just the defense, but we'll say the defense. Um, he is ready to make this step as a head coach. Do you think that it is his time? Whereas regarding Josh McCown, he's only, I say only, still a hell of an achievement. Josh McCown, again, he's been in the league for ages and ages. He's only a quarterbacks coach at the moment. And then you mentioned Joe Brady. He's an offensive coordinator. Out of those three, who do you think is most ready, regardless of who you want? Out of those three, which I think it's fair to say are probably high on most people's lists, is more ready to become a head coach than the others?
Yeah, those would probably be my top three. Almost in whatever order you wanted to put them in, I could be swayed. But I would have to say Aaron Glenn is most qualified to be a head coach, much more so than these two other candidates. But I do think the other two could be quality candidates. McCown, the only really quarterbacks coach to head coach I can find right now in the league is Zach Taylor with the Bengals. So. Yeah, he has success now with a really good quarterback. He went to the Super Bowl, but there were seasons where they had 2 wins before they got Burrow, and they were calling for his head. So it's going to be tough if you did go that route, and those were the results for the first few seasons, and now you have a first-time guy entering his second or third year as a head coach, and you're entering your 16th season now in the playoff drought, and the pressure's on him, and if he doesn't have his quarterback, it's going to be a big problem. And then Joe Brady, I think he probably, to me, is the most intriguing offensive guy that we've interviewed, at least, because he has learned from different steps along the way. Obviously, at LSU, I don't want to say he developed Joe Burrow, but he had a hand in his success there. Obviously, had a phenomenal last season at LSU, so he played a part in that. And then he comes over and he's now helping Josh Allen. And for the last, season and a half, Joe Brady has been near flawless as a play caller, a coordinator. So that's not to say he can't run a whole team, but that's the intriguing part to me about him. So I would probably put it Aaron Glenn far and away qualified to be a head coach. The way that Ben Johnson spoke about him the other day, Ben Johnson basically wanted to say Aaron was more qualified than he was to take a head coaching gig. Like that's almost what he slipped up and said at at that press conference. So I would say Aaron Glenn far and away. The offensive guys probably speak just as highly as the defensive guys, like you said. Not a bad word is spoken about him. Anzalone, I believe, had a spot with the media and he just, gushed praises over him. So that is the guy to me. And like Jets ties or not, I would pick him saying that qualified as a qualified candidate. And then I'd say number two is Joe Brady, and then number three is Josh McCown, but they're very close. Um, but yeah, those are my top three in terms of candidates, and then Flores would probably be four.
Do you think well, two out of those three know the New York market and everything that goes with it? Joe Brady, I don't believe has any ties in with the New York media
hmm
market. Do you think that Joe Brady could survive in the New York market?
I think there's a good chance he could, especially if he were to hire a veteran defensive coordinator. People are probably gonna, vomit when I say Ron Rivera, but a Ron Rivera type of defensive coordinator who you could also make maybe your assistant head coach and just lean on for experience. And I think the same could go for Josh McCown, but I think Joe Brady being in Buffalo, not saying they're a big market because they're absolutely not, but I think seeing the Jets from a little bit of a closer perspective than, other coaches does give him help, but it's always tough to say, can this guy handle the New York market? He's not like a GM candidate who's going to talk to the media 5, 6 times in a calendar year. He's going to talk to them 4 times a week. So it's going to be a lot different when, Joe Brady starts 1-4 hypothetically, and you got Kaz, Samini, Hughes, Rosenblatt just like asking you all the questions you didn't want to answer 5 games into your tenure as a head coach for the first time. So it does make it really tough, and I do think Aaron Glenn has um, a leg up in terms of that. He still speaks to Parcells, so he has the acumen from Parcells to know what the media is like, but also know what the building is like. So he has a leg up in a lot of perspectives, and that's what makes him probably a far and away more qualified candidate to me.
You touched on something earlier on, which I want to get back to. So we'll just focus on the three candidates that we've talked about. It doesn't matter who comes in as head coach for us next year or this year. Um, the obvious talking point is going to be who's going to be at quarterback. So if it was an offensive head coach, will it make more of a difference with what we have at the moment in Aaron Rodgers, Tyrod Taylor, and everybody else behind? Do you think it would be better if we had an offensive head coach, bearing in mind that we've got Aaron Rodgers still here, who may or may not be here? Rich Samini tweeted yesterday that there was a 30% chance. I'm not quite sure where this percentage is pulled from, but there was a
In there.
30% chance that he would be staying. But we've had conversations about should he stay or should he go
Mhm.
forever. So I'm not really asking that. What I'm asking is, would it be better for the next head coach coming in to have an Aaron Rodgers, or do you think it is better for a clean slate, bearing in mind that they're probably going to get a 5-year contract, but they'll probably be only asked to work 4, which seems to be the MO of the NFL these days.
Mhm. I think so. The defensive coaches, I know we're speaking mostly just about the three, but we can lump Flores in too. I think Glenn and Flores, it was reported they would be leaning to bring Aaron Rodgers back. That was one of the national reports on like a podcast or TV spot that they did, and they said Glenn and Flores would probably lean to bring Aaron Rodgers back, and I think that's probably the right move because they're their power or like their leadership in the room to me could override the Aaron Rodgers factor more so than what Salah and Ulbrich clearly couldn't do last year. They were not going to tell Rodgers no. Like in the scenario of the Minnesota injury, I think a Flores and a Glenn would say, hey man, in the best interest of the team, we have to sit you down and play Tyrod. Maybe I'm wrong in that, but I think that would be they have the prowess as, leaders in the locker room to take over and make those executive decisions. Brady and Josh McCown would make me a little bit more nervous because one, they're just closer to Rodgers' age. McCown, as a former player, is going to probably sympathize a little bit more with the player in that situation and say, "Hey, man, I understand you're toughing it out, but like we really don't want to play you this game." I feel like McCown might have a harder time sitting him in that scenario, but to me, I could see a scenario where every single coach that is in contention for this job wants to bring him back just based off last year's performance, projection of 1 year removed from the Achilles, and just the landscape of the quarterback position, the market in terms of draft and free agency. So I could see a scenario where every coach wants him back, and Rich's 30% came out of thin air. But if you asked any beat writer 6 weeks ago, that 30% probably would have been 5 to 10%. So the fact that it's swinging up makes me more, obviously as a fan of Rodgers, it makes me more encouraged that he could be the quarterback again, but there's nothing to say definitively that these guys are leaning one way or the other.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you bring up some really good points, especially like first year coaches like McCown and the age thing. So there are other options out there, and I know we've talked about this during the week, and it's retread coaches.
Hmm.
Um, whether they work on another team straight away or whether they need a break before joining another team. And we discussed this the other day. And bearing in mind, let's play devil's advocate here and say that Rodgers is going to stay. And you've alluded to the fact that you think a lot of coaches would prefer to have him
Hmm.
staying on. Does having Rodgers say that I'm so split on this, and I think most fans are. Um, I have to air that I'm more of a Rodgers denier than I am an acceptor. That I
Hmm.
think that he would be able to take us to the playoffs next year. But if a new coach came in and we did end up going to the playoffs, first off, does that buy you another year? So, for example, Rodgers is only going to be here for another year, say. So then you've got 3 years to turn this ship around and hopefully make the playoffs again. So would you not be better off having an experienced head coach now, someone like McCarthy, who's just come back into the fold now, or do you think someone like McCarthy, like Harbaugh, takes some time away from the NFL, then comes back, or do you think it would be a good idea if this is the model that the Jets are going to go with, that they really would prefer to keep Rodgers and mentor, say, another quarterback? Say, I don't think we will draft one this year, um, but should that happen, would that be the best scenario going forward?
Yeah, and like you said, we talked about it earlier in the week, and I did a little bit of research. And this is why I spoke about McCarthy earlier, but didn't want to completely divulge all my pro McCarthy stuff. But this is a lot of the reason
Let
why.
it rip.
Currently, currently in the NFL, we have six retread head coaches in the league: Sean Payton, Andy Reid, Jim Harbaugh, Dan Quinn, Raheem Morris, and Todd Bowles. Five of them made the playoffs. Only Raheem Morris did not with Atlanta. This is this past season. Morris was a head coach from 2009 to 2011, so you're talking about a decade before he got his next try as a head coach. So he took a very long step away from the NFL. Harbaugh had the next longest time off because he went the college route, became the head coach at Michigan, worked his way back. And then most of the other guys were out of the league for a year or two or even less. In the case of Andy Reid, he was right back in. Todd Bowles was immediately a DC in Tampa Bay and then worked his way back up. Sean Payton, I think, left for a year after New Orleans, so he came back, and then Dan Quinn was immediately hired as a DC. So I consider a retread hire the most successful path right now for the Jets. If you're talking about just the success rate of we need to find a candidate who's been there, done that, got the t-shirt, and that's why I think Mike McCarthy is my number one. We have that's 6 out of 32 coaches. You're talking about almost a quarter of the league. You add McCarthy into that mix because of what he did going from Green Bay to Dallas. I would consider that a success. So now you're talking about 7 coaches. And McCarthy has a chance to do it a third time around. So McCarthy, to me, if they would wisen up and interview him, because it seems like he wants the job, and I don't think it's an Aaron Rodgers, per se narrative that's keeping him from taking the interview. I just don't know if the Jets, we heard they did the research on him in 2019 and didn't like what they found. Let's be honest, the people in the building in 2019 were nitwits, to be nice. So whatever research they found, I don't want to listen to anyway. I'd rather trust random guy on Twitter with his charts about what the Jets find as far as research there. So I think you have to give McCarthy a chance. This data is too big of a sample size for me to ignore it when you're talking about almost a quarter of the league having success. So McCarthy is the guy for me. Um, and like I said, it might be a Rodgers thing where they think that he would keep him. So Woody's like, I don't want a candidate who's going to keep Rodgers because there's this big rift. And as we know, that's not the way it should go. and they should let the GM and the head coach decide. But if you want to give me a guy who's done it before as a head coach, I would love that. Give me a Cliff Kingsbury even. That's another name that should have been getting interviews, especially after the performance he put on last night. So give me a retread hire. I think that's probably the way to go.
Yeah. Cliff Kingsbury, of course, he was with Arizona and didn't have
Hmm.
a very good outing in Arizona. Rookie head coach, rookie quarterback. It's all very similar to what we experienced in New York with Salah, Mike LaFleur, and Zach Wilson when that all came about. I think you've got to get the balance right. Obviously, we still haven't got our successor at quarterback. Jordan Travis essentially is going to be a rookie next year after recovering, if he recovers from his injuries. So we
Hmm.
still really haven't got a successor. Can you see us picking a quarterback up in the draft? And like I said earlier, having him sit behind Rodgers for a year if we went quarterback round 1 or round 2.
Yeah, I certainly would be an advocate of this. Obviously, at the seventh overall pick, I don't advise taking Jalen Milroe, but whatever their pick is in the sixth round or second round, excuse me, I believe it would be the sixth selection in the second round, so maybe pick 39. If you could either package that and come up into the end of the first round and get a quarterback, even if it's not Jalen Milroe, I think that would be the most optimal, ideal option for me. You get the fifth year option on a guy. You have just that longevity of figuring it out. If you want him after a year behind Rodgers, like you said with Jordan Travis, I don't think right now it's a net zero, and you don't want to put any eggs into that basket as a QB2 or a potential I got to suit him up and play in 2025, and you'd rather take a swing. But there's tons of guys. I'm going to do a longer dive on Jalen Milroe because he's at the Senior Bowl. But I like a guy from Ohio State, Will Howard. He's a guy that to me looked like he progressed throughout the season. The first couple games watching Ohio State was a little rough for him, but then he turned it around, led them back into the playoff picture, and they went pretty far into the playoffs. Now they're playing for the championship. So Will Howard is a guy to me who is getting a ton of exposure in the playoffs too, which is going to help his draft stock. But I see him as a developmental guy. A lot of people like Jackson Dart from Ole Miss. So there's tons of guys, and I haven't done the depth on the mid round guys to say definitively who my flag is going to be planted on. But I'm still in the camp of yes, go get Jalen Milroe at pick 28. He has the traits that are going to make him an NFL player, and you just have to have the development strategy in place, and that comes down to coaching and also front office and your personnel department. So a lot of things will have to hit right for a Milroe type candidate to be a success, but I'm still in the camp that that is very, very doable for this team.
It sounds more like the quarterback crop in the upcoming draft is going to be more outside of the top, possibly 2, possibly 3 quarterbacks. It sounds more like
Hmm.
it's going to be a draft for developmental quarterbacks moving forward. So you would take a quarterback this year, later in the first round, if we could move back up. How about next year? Can you see next year any quarterbacks that would be more in
Well,
line with us?
I was going to say the obvious one that everyone's going to point to is Archie Manning. And I'm not saying that he will or won't be a fit for the Jets. Obviously, we know how things have worked out when Manning's advised us to do anything. Um, but I don't know if he's coming out this year or if he's not eligible. But the guy from South Carolina, and maybe this is just a bias because I lived in South Carolina for 3.5 years, but Lenoris Sellers is a guy to me, physical. I'm trying to get his measurements, 6'3", 242. They have him listed as running a 4.6, 240, so he's very, agile for his frame. He's a guy to me that I've watched, and I've watched a ton of South Carolina, again, being a little biased, but he's a guy to me, just without knowing the depth of the class. I believe the Tennessee quarterback, and I'm going to butcher his name, Nico Amaliva from Tennessee. He's another guy who balled out in Tennessee this year. Tons of arm strength. I'm not sure about arm talent. And then you have the Garrett Nussmeier and Drew Aller um, duo. They went back. They were probably going to be high picks this year just based on the weak quarterback class. But I think if they go back and have good seasons at LSU and Penn State respectively, those are guys that are probably going to work their way into the top 10 conversation next year. And just because I say top 10 doesn't mean the Jets need to stink to get a top 10 pick. You can trade up. Like, that's a thing. If there's a non QB needy team in this pick that you want and they're willing to trade out, things can happen. You can get up and get your quarterback. I don't necessarily fall into the mindset of we need to stink in 2025 in order to position ourselves to get a quarterback. If the dominoes fall that way and, we're 0-13 with an Adam Gase led team and Braden Mann makes a tackle that makes us lose out on Trevor Lawrence, yeah, that's a different circumstance. But I don't think this team is in a position to be that bad to get it naturally. So you can trade up and go get a quarterback. And I think there's going to be options down the road if they don't necessarily immediately address it.
Yeah, I think we're going to do. I don't know. My gut feeling is whoever comes in. I think we've fallen so far down where we need to be. We all thought that the Joe Douglas and Salah combination was going to be a brand new dawn, and we were going to take off, and this was the start of something good, and we were going to produce a factory of good players and good coaches and all the rest of it. And it just didn't happen. It just did not happen. And they had more than enough time to sort it out. In hindsight, some of the things I've said were just completely wrong. I thought that Douglas should have stayed. I thought it was wrong the way Douglas got treated at the end, but there's a lot of stuff coming out, whether you believe it or not. It's all very, very messy. But I think in the cold light of day, I think they did, as a team, they had more than enough time to turn things around, and they just didn't do it. And you can point to stuff like, oh, well, they didn't have an offensive coordinator, or they didn't have a quarterback. Yeah, they're all really valid points, but at no point did it ever get overcome. And the things that you could control, like the discipline within the team and the motivation within the team, and it just wasn't there. So one thing I will credit Joe Douglas with is he's left the team better than he found it, especially defensive line. So can't argue with that. But I'm looking at these playoffs, and you've got teams like the Commanders and Detroit Lions, who I would put them in the same bracket as us, is perennial bottom feeders, is what I'm calling them. Year in, year out, bottom of their divisions, not going anywhere. They've got a fan base similar to ours, or not as bad as ours. We are the longest suffering, as you said. What, now 16 years without playoffs potentially, but can you see us doing a Commanders or a Lions next year? Personally, I don't know why I feel this way, but I feel quite upbeat that we can't get any worse, can we?
I hate to say it
Oh no.
exactly that way, is that we can't get any worse. We could, obviously, but I have plenty of reason for optimism that you get the right guys in here, and obviously you have to identify first the right guys and then be able to hire them and, allow them to execute their vision. But if you do that, there's no reason why in the first 40 to 50 games of this regime, and we know Joe Douglas got 94 games and Salah got however many it was. I think it was like 60 or 70 games. We will know before that point that they are the right guys or not. Now, does that come with an extension or does that come with a firing? I'm not sure. But we should know within the first 2 years, okay, they had enough talent in year one. If they want to go the bridge quarterback option in Aaron Rodgers, say, hey, we're going to maybe not do the all-in strategy, but we're going to do a competitive retooling. I don't even want to say rebuild, because I don't think it is a rebuild based on, like you said, the foundation that Joe Douglas put in and left for the team. But a competitive rebuild puts you in a position where why couldn't you be the Steelers of this year or the Broncos of this year, where you had a team that probably wasn't supposed to make it, and then you slide in the AFC, and maybe you do get bounced in the first round. But in my opinion, you get a team that has Aaron Rodgers to the playoffs, and you're not just a wild card team anymore. You're a playoff team. It's different. If the Broncos had Bo Nix or Aaron Rodgers going into that game? Which would they feel more confident with, even if they had Bo Nix for the whole season? So that's the difference. We're watching all these games. I don't know if there's a game yet where the lesser quarterback has won the game. Is there a scenario so far in this playoff where the worst quarterback has won? I don't think there is. Maybe today with Jalen Hurts and Matt Stafford would be the argument, but you need a quarterback in these playoffs. So you give a competitive rebuild year one, and if you get to the playoffs, God forbid they break this drought, Gus,
Hmm.
that buys them 4 years, regardless of what their contract says. They're going to be paraded, maybe even fossilized in a statue out front of Jet Life,
Mount
just for
Rushmore.
making the playoffs. You know what I mean? It's like it's that serious to the fan base that we just make the playoffs. It's not a matter of go for the Super Bowl, and I hate saying it like that because the goal is the Super Bowl every year. But if you for one season just make the playoffs and then you're like, okay, now we can rebuild, you have confidence in that coaching staff, in that front office to make the right decision in year two to pivot into your next quarterback, your future plans. So I'm full believer in don't tear it down and sell us a vision of we're going to be bad to be good, and let's go compete at least somewhat next year, regardless of who the quarterback is.
Would it not be worth? I mean, if I'm playing devil's advocate here. So if we go back all in on trying to reach the playoffs again in 2025, and we keep Rodgers and we keep Devontae Adams, etc., um, we're going to have a massive dead cap here. He has said that he will take a pay cut. Our friend on Twitter, Michael Pallas on Jets Cap, I've said this yesterday in the podcast. Even if Rodgers and Devontae Adams took a 50% pay cut, the dead cap is still going to be put after 2025. It's going to be somewhere in the region of 80 million again. So
Hmm.
you're still saddling yourself with a huge amount of dead cap for the sake of reaching the playoffs. I get what you're saying. Success breeds success, and making the playoffs, yeah, it's going to make a lot of people happy. Even if we're one and done in the playoffs, we've reached the playoffs. It's not that great embarrassing thing in the whole of US sports. The Jets haven't made the playoffs. Which is just mind blowing. But is it worth putting it all back in, or do you not think it should be the right thing to do? You got a new crew coming in, new GM, new head coach, all the rest of it is to let them do their thing, let them start from scratch, eat a lot of the cap post June 1st, and then start over again in the shape that they want to, rather than running out what we've seen with a previous regime, putting a band-aid on it, and for the sake of one playoff appearance.
And I think the difficulty in trying to decide the right answer in this is a reason why you might not see some of these names wanting to take the job. If I'm Todd Monken, do I want to have this lingering decision above my head in my first head coaching gig? Obviously, it's a GM decision as well, but if I'm involved in a decision that hypothetically we let Aaron Rodgers walk and he's playing somewhere else in the NFL and we're not good without him, what is the narrative going to be? So it makes it extremely difficult to try to answer one way or the other. Um, to me, I do think it's worth it to try to not like I don't want to call it an all-in season because you're not going to go, break the bank for Tyron Smiths and Mike Williams and this and that. You're going to go for the more efficient signings, those B tier guys and, be less cap effective, knowing what's coming down the road. So I wouldn't call it like push all the chips into the table, but at least surround yourself with enough depth, let's call it depth type players where you could make a push because we saw as soon as our top line guys got hurt, it wasn't worth it. Um, with the depth we had, we knew we weren't going to make it with the safeties that were playing, the corners that were playing, the backup offensive tackles that were playing on this team. So that's the difference to me. Where I wouldn't call it an all in, but I would call it an aggressive competitive rebuild. But like I said, that's the hardest decision anybody's going to make about this team is what to do with Rodgers, in my opinion. And I don't want to be tasked with having to do that job if I'm a GM or a head coach. So they're going to have to, lay out every single simulation scenario that they can figure out to determine if Rodgers is worth it or not. And I've kind of resigned myself to if they move on, they move on. If they want to keep him, they want to keep him. I'll be excited and I'll root for the team either way. What I don't think I can get behind is them letting him walk and him going somewhere else and not being on the couch in retirement. And that's going to hurt me the most is watching him play somewhere else because then you just get to see what he did have left in the tank. And like you could argue, he's 1 year removed from the AC or the Achilles, but he's also going to be 42 at the end of the season. So there's a pro and a con to it. Sean Merriman said that he was better his second year off the Achilles. So that's a position that's putting a lot of strain on the muscle as well. So quarterback is a position to me where as long as he's not getting killed like in Minnesota, he has enough juice left. So I don't want to make the decision for the team because I'd probably just pick Aaron Rodgers and turn off my social media apps and not listen to the repercussions. But I could see it either way, and that's the unfortunate part is right now they have to make such a tough decision.
Yeah, and there's been Bruce Hall put a tweet out last week giving support for having Rodgers coming back because obviously Rodgers has
Hmm.
had some pressers saying he didn't know whether he was coming back, and on the back of that, Bruce Hall put in a supportive tweet saying he wanted him back. Um, and there was somebody else that also retweeted. I think it was Garrett Wilson, which is quite a surprise because we're all
Hmm.
led to believe that if Aaron Rodgers is coming back, Garrett Wilson's walking out the door, which is completely the contrary to what we've been led to believe. So who knew that the media
Hmm.
sources don't know what they're talking about?
It's truly amazing, isn't it, that like you see I'll go all the way back to training camp, the sideline debate that they had on the sideline and they were just getting the best out of each other in a practice. And that's when it started that they didn't like each other. And it's like I don't see how you see a 3 second clip and assume the worst. I get it. We're the Jets and it's easy to pile on or, pick the negative side historically and you'll be correct more than you'll be incorrect. But the narrative surrounding it has been weird. There was a report like last month, like at the end of December, that one of the things is if they bring Rodgers back, Will Garrett demand a trade. And it's like, how do we know for sure one way or the other based off of a sideline outburst and him asking to throw the fade route? So I don't know. It's a lot of blown up stuff to me that I think is just driving narratives because they asked Garrett every single week after that about if he wanted to leave. So I don't understand why they do that either because do you want him to leave or do you want him to stay? Like point your question in a way of like, hey Garrett, there's a lot of, rumors about you possibly leaving, but do you want to like put that to bed and say you want to be with the Jets instead of saying, Garrett, a lot of rumors that you don't want to be here. What do you think? And he's like, I don't know. I just want to be where my feet are. And people run with it. So it's the way the question's asked. It's the way they're pulling at the emotion of both the player and the fan that it's media, that's their job, they have to get the sentence that they want at the end of the day. But to me I don't think it's we have Rodgers, we don't have Garrett, and we have to decide between the two.
It's going to be whoever comes in, the GM and the head coach, they are going to have their work cut out for them initially
Absolutely.
when they get in, sorting this roster out. And obviously, there's that if whoever comes in and they do want to let Rodgers go, I think there is going to be some feeling within the locker room. Maybe not ill will, but some sadness in there if Rodgers does go, obviously, and there might be some people in that locker room that will be glad to see the back of him. Who knows? But
Hmm.
we're going to need. We go back to the head coach search. So we're under pretty much the understanding that we probably feel that the Jets are going to hire Aaron Glenn or possibly McCown as
Hmm.
first time head coaches. Is this an ideal scenario for a rookie head coach to be walking into? Obviously, it depends on who the GM is. So if we're going to go down that route of having a rookie head coach, who, if it's Glenn or McCown, which GMs do you think are going to be? I mean, Borganzi is now out of the question. He's gone to the Titans. So we're now limited. We're not limited. There are quite a few candidates. which GMs do you think are going to be more suited to sorting out, putting out fires? I don't think putting out fires is the right phrase, but coming in and settling the waters within a Jets team, which, let's face it, over the last 5-6 years, it's been shaken to pieces to its foundations, and we are where we are now. We had such a talented roster at the beginning of this season, and no one saw, unless you're, I'm not going to mention any names. There are some people on Twitter that are never ever happy. I'm not going to give
Yes.
them, and it didn't matter. We could have had Pro Bowlers at every single position and still say we weren't going to win. But I think most of us thought that we were going to make the playoffs. We were going to get a wild card, at least a wild card position. And there was many of us that even thought that we might have won the division, and we just imploded. 5 games in, Woody made an almighty decision, whether you like it or not. Took away the head coach, Bob Sala,
Hmm.
and no one else was brought in, and then made someone an interim coach that hadn't got any experience. But no one else was brought in. This is the problem I had with it, is they brought no one in as DC. So who's doing that? Because you can't expect an interim coach to become a head coach and a DC and
Right.
not expect any fallout from it. So obviously we've had all this turmoil. Players have got memories. Players understand. Players are now looking to seeing who the next guy coming in, and they're going to want some stability. So I'll go back to the question originally I was trying to ask you in a very cack-handed way. Is there a GM out there more suitable for this situation than others, and who are they, or who is it even?
So the Samini report gave three names, and I'll get into those um, at the end because I want to give two names that weren't on the list as guys that I thought could have handled the situation well, and that would have been Thomas Dimitrov. He was a former Falcons general manager for 12 or 13 seasons, and he dealt with Matt Ryan um, throughout the entirety of his career, so he obviously knows what it's like to have a Hall of Fame potential level quarterback and deal with the, traversing of his career, what to do at the back end of his career, this and that. So I think Dimitrov would have been a guy to me that could have not fixed the situation, but helped clear the situation up. And obviously he has an analytics background, so he's going to come from a more, um, obviously analytic point of view, and everything is going to be more pointed to the numbers more so than the emotion and feelings behind it. So maybe he has more of a direct path to clearing up that situation. And then also Chris Spielman, I thought could have had a chance just based on what he did with the Lions as president and CEO, former player background, so he knows a little bit about the locker room, obviously, and the environment, the football environment more so. But when you get into the names that Rich Cimini put out, I think these might be the three best names to figure out the situation based on what we know of their backgrounds. Mike Greenberg, the assistant Bucks GM, who I guess he's labeled as the salary cap guy because that's what his background is, but he looks to me like an all-encompassing type of GM where he's going to be good with communications and relations in the building. He's going to be good at putting together a staff of both analytic personnel, excuse me, scouting backgrounds. So I think to him, for me, he's an intriguing name that I haven't heard too many bad things about, but also the Bucks organization is full of great executives that you don't know who the best one is outside of their general manager. And then you have Alec Hallaby, the assistant Eagles general manager. And I think to me, he is somebody that in look is the complete opposite of Joe Douglas. Joe Douglas was the football guy. He was what was he, the Turk? And, he's the guy that brings you to get cut on Hard Knocks. And Alec Hallaby looks like, the Andrew Garfield version of Spider-Man, skinny, frail, the money ball. He's going to be labeled the money ball guy who's just going to point to the board and say, that guy gets first downs. We need to sign him type of, GM. But I think he's more than that just based on his, um, obviously his high IQ background going to Harvard, and he's worked his way up for 17 years in the Eagles organization. He stayed there the entirety of his career, so he's somebody who's seen he's seen the consistency of the Eagles for the last almost 2 decades, and he's worked his way up almost like a Borgonzi, where he's held 6 or 7 different titles over that 17-year career, where it's not like he just came on when the Chiefs got Patrick Mahomes and were good all of a sudden. And for the last 5 years, he's been riding the coattails of success of other people. So Halaby to me is an intriguing one, even though I like to goof on what he looks like. I think he's actually a very qualified candidate, and he's, I believe, under 40 years old. So this is a guy who, like I said, younger than Rodgers. So it's going to be a interesting dynamic to say the least. And then the last guy on Rich's list was John Eric Sullivan, the VP of Player Personnel for the Packers. This guy was in Green Bay for, again, 2 decades. So guess who he's worked with his entire career? Aaron Rodgers. He got there the year before Aaron was drafted. Obviously, I don't think he was the one that put Rodgers on the radar, but there's reports that he was the one that put Jordan Love on Gutekunst's radar. And Jordan Love has had a fair bit of success in his 2 years as a starter in Green Bay, taking over for Rodgers. So this is a guy who's just seen, decades of consistency and success on a daily basis. So to me, those 3 names as potential finalists, you get your list down from 15 to 3. It's a big, you're eliminating a lot of candidates there, obviously. So to get it down to 3, I think those Greenberg, Halaby, John Eric Sullivan, I think those are probably the best 3 names. And that's maybe me being a little homer because I'm a Jets fan and I don't know enough about these guys. But if you're talking specifically about cleaning up a mess and trying to navigate muddy, murky, rough waters and keep the boat afloat, give me a guy who is more leaning toward a CEO full encompassing background as a GM instead of like a hit the road as a scout personnel guy, because we need to clean up the back end of the organization as well as the drafting and signing of players. We need to get out of the cap mess with Rodgers. We need to do a lot of, not accumulating of draft picks, but just efficiency of draft selection. So a lot of that stuff could be cleaned up with these guys, I believe.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going with it. It's not just a new regime coming in and saying, right, here we are, this is what we're going to do.
Right.
There is a lot of tidying up, a lot of caretaker work to be done on the previous incumbents, and there's going to be a lot of conversations with.
And sorry, just one
Go
last
on.
point on that. I think the roster building aspect of the team being where it is and not being in the doldrums of 2020 helps you when you can look at the other things of the organization that we just talked about, the cap situations, the building communications and relations, the building out a staff. You have a roster foundation in place. So once you make those difficult roster decisions, you don't really have to make a ton of hard ones to get your team back into a good spot. You have to make the right ones, but it allows you to focus on the non-roster building things of being a GM, the administrative things that Saleh always struggled as a head coach. Obviously, as a GM, those are going to be struggles too. So the roster building being where it is definitely helps accelerate the GM's process.
Interestingly, Salah is getting requests for interviews as well, so there is a
Who
good
knew?
chance that he's going to be a head coach in 2025. So we may end up
Yeah.
facing a Robert Salah team.
Yeah. If not, he's going to be a defensive coordinator. And Ulbrich got hired as the Falcons
Yeah,
DC yesterday. And
I'm
I
thrilled
think
about
they're
that, to
both.
be honest.
Yeah, I think he was going to be a linebackers coach. Obviously, I'm glad he got a better job than I thought he would get. Not worthy of being a head coach. Obviously, we saw that, but Saleh, I still think he could be a top candidate for a DC anywhere. But the fact that you're getting 3 head coaching looks, and the Jaguars said he might be the one that got away when he was their
Oh,
linebackers coach, I think that's strong,
it is.
endorsement for him to get a head coaching job very quickly.
I mean, there's a lot of people. Well, and this is kind of endorsing what a lot of Jets fans have said, that Salah didn't get a fair crack because he didn't have a offensive coordinator, because he didn't have a quarterback.
Yeah.
You can, yeah, but at the end of the
I was the
day,
biggest, yeah, I was the biggest solid guy, and I can't say that anymore. Like,
right,
yeah, you had Provo, Jamarcus Russell, and a bad version of a GM that was closer to Matt Millen than he was anything else. But like, those aren't excuses that you can necessarily take with you when at the end of the day you just weren't a good head coach.
yeah, absolutely. I think if you can't see it by now, you're never going to see it. But
Hmm.
you're going back to roster building. there's something happening in the Hancock Whitney Stadium on February the 1st in 2025 this year. It's the Senior Bowl, and our own Dylan Tellerman is going to be there, I believe.
I will. Yes, I'm very excited. I leave a week from tomorrow. I will be on a flight to Pensacola, Florida to get down to Mobile, and I'm super excited. This will be my fourth year. Um, and the crop of just sheer volume of prospects this year is much larger than any other year I've seen. And I think there's a lot of reasons into this. I think the college football playoff definitely skews it. Players are playing longer into the season. So, for example, Notre Dame and Ohio State have, I think, three or four prospects apiece going down to the Senior Bowl, including Riley Leonard, the notable quarterback from Notre Dame, and Will Howard, their quarterback from Ohio State. These guys are playing tomorrow in a football game. Are they going to travel down to Mobile and then play 3 days of practice and then a game, even though it's a small dosage of the game? I don't know. So I think the volume of prospects being so large is going to get dwindled down where a lot of these guys come from interviews and medicals and all those things, press conferences, meeting up with teams. So it's not going to be performance based for a lot of these playoff team guys, but there's over 130 prospects, I believe, right now going down to Mobile. So I'm very excited.
And of course, the guy that is actually directing all this, Jim Nagy, he's had an interview with us with our GM
hmm
as well. So you never know. The new GM of the New York Jets might actually be in Mobile, Alabama as well.
And we have the current interim GM of the Jets was the former director of the Senior Bowl in Phil Savage. So it's cool to see how it's possible for executives to work their way into the NFL from this game. So Jim Nagy getting an interview is not a farce like a lot of people think. And I thought he was a very good candidate if they hired a Dimitrov to get a scouting personnel type job with the Jets, and they hired two guys. So I thought the Nagy interview was well deserved. He runs a great week of camp, and that's just not me being biased. I think his relations are great. So I thought he was a very viable candidate for a role with the Jets.
Oh, it's an amazing thing. I mean, I've been getting into it, I think probably the last 2 years, and it's super exciting. On now follow that you can follow the Senior Bowl on Twitter, the Reese's Senior Bowl on Twitter, and
hmm
when you do follow them, they'll give you all the retweets of people that have been invited to the game and all the practices. And they got the East. Are you going to the East West Shrine game as well?
No, I won't be able to. That's taking place this upcoming week. Historically, it's East West Shrine, and then everybody flies in from, I believe it's hosted in Vegas or somewhere in Texas, maybe, and all the people fly in from East West Shrine immediately to the Senior Bowl. So, unfortunately, I couldn't make the first leg of the two bowl game trip, but that's on the list. Eventually, my goal is to hit all the off-season things whether it's to Shrine Bowl and then Senior Bowl and then the Combine. My goal is to hit all the off-season big ones eventually.
I'm sure you'll get there. And of course, when you're out in the Senior Bowl next week, there is a really, really good chance. Now we've got some teams knocked out of the playoffs. Again, we'll go back to Aaron Glenn. Aaron Glenn is now available. Um, which happens first, a GM announcement or a head coaching announcement?
Just reading the tea leaves. Again, going back to the Rich
Putting you on
Cimini
the
article,
spot.
or yeah, I know the Rich Cimini thing this morning said 24 hours we could have these meetings being conducted in the second round. A couple weeks ago, I said on Buffalo Jets Pod that January the 20th was my deadline, not deadline to get a GM candidate hired, but I think if we see a significant amount of movement this afternoon and tomorrow, we could have a GM signed or hired, excuse me, by Tuesday morning. And then from there, I would love to see the GM in the room, in person with the candidates now that they can in person interview the playoff coaches. I would love to see the GM in the room, get the guy hired as a head coach by maybe Wednesday or Thursday. And then you have a contingency of, okay, we're going to send Phil Savage. XYZ scouts and this new face that we just hired. You're going to go to the Senior Bowl. This coach is going to come with you. So we need to start getting those things in place, in my opinion, so that we know who we're sending, because if you don't have representation at these events, you're behind the eight ball. And Phil Savage was at the Hula Bowl. There was the picture circulating with him and Connie Carberg. Shout out to both of them. And I honestly, I tip my hat to Phil Savage. He's such a
Yeah,
great person. I met him in the Pensacola airport last year. Just such a nice person. And the fact that he's still, you know, obviously he's got a job to do, so he's still working. He doesn't know if he's going to get fired when they hire a new GM, and he's still going to all these events. He's still doing
yeah.
his job for the team. So absolutely shout out to Phil. But you need people in place that are going to go to these events and scout for you. So that, to me, it makes me think that Phil is probably going to stay if they hire a new GM, obviously. But yeah, it's tough for me. You want to get these guys in place to get them down there, eyes on, hands on, speaking to the players as soon as possible.
You pretty much preempted my next question, which was going to be, does Phil Savage stay on? And I really hope he does. I saw that tweet as well with Connie Carberg and Phil Savage.
Yeah,
And as you say, I mean, the guy doesn't know whether he's going to have a job or not, and he's going about his business as he should be, but it must be very, very difficult to do so. He's just going about his business as if he's going to be here this time next year, which is excellent. I have to say, I do like what the scouting team have done this last few years. So I think there are some pretty good brains behind the scenes when it comes to scouting. So I hope that they either get retained, or if someone better comes along, brilliant. But I do think that the scouting part of what the Jets have been doing in recent years has been pretty good.
absolutely. That was one of the departments that I said the Jets probably shouldn't look to tear down to the studs. And everybody be like, why? Everything's a joke here. Everything's a mess. The scouting department is not a mess. And not to say that these are all Joe Douglas guys, but the guys that they elevated into roles after they fired Rex Hogan and Chad Alexander, whether that was the right or wrong answer, the guys like Jay Mendelesi, John Carr, who else are we looking at? Dom Green, some of these national scout guys too. Like the guys that got shifted around in the scouting department, they're very good at their jobs, in my opinion. So I think some of these guys do need to stay. I met a college scout, Andy Davis. He made one of the phone calls on draft day in like day 3. He made one of the phone calls to the selections, and it was cool to see that because he saw me in the airport and came up to me and talked to me. So they're good people, but they're also good at their job, in my opinion. So scouting department is one that don't tear it down. Get new analytics, get new pro personnel, but scouting I think is been solid.
Yeah. Let's wrap this up. I want to get a prediction from you. I am going to put you on the spot. I know you like
Sweet.
being put on the spot.
Always.
Right. This time next week, let's say Samini is right, and we've got the GM. I think this is the right way around to do it too, as well. Get the GM first, and get the announcement. Get the GM talking to potential head coaches as well. This time next week at the podium, there's a new GM and there's a new head coach. Who are they?
Okay, I'm gonna give you two options so I don't have to back myself entirely into a corner. I'm going to give you Lance Newmark and Aaron Glenn because those two seem to be pairing. They have familiarity with each other when Newmark was in Detroit. So I'm going to say Newmark as GM with Aaron Glenn as the head coach. But I also don't want to dismiss the possibility of Alec Hallaby and Josh McCown.
Yeah.
I think that's more of the high upside swing for the fences. We're going to go against the grain of what we historically do in the defensive guy. And we're going to go a year early and say, hey, Josh, lead this team. We trust you. We'll give you the leash and see if you could turn this thing around. So I'd go Newmark, Glenn as the safe one, and Hallaby, McCown as my wild card.
Interesting. I wouldn't have a problem with any of that. I think at the
Hmm.
end of the day, whoever's in charge, there are a couple of candidates that I would prefer they weren't, but if they do, obviously we all get behind them because that's what we do. But
Yeah.
interesting stuff, Dylan. Where can people find you? Tell people what you've been up to and where they can find you.
Yeah, absolutely. You can follow me directly on Twitter and Instagram at Tereman. That's Tereman. You can follow my content on Jetnation, at Jetnation on all social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, jetnation.com. You can check out all my articles, which with the draft coming up, I'll have most likely a Senior Bowl primer, a Senior Bowl review of almost every day, if not a recap of the week. Should be doing a couple spots with other people's podcasts coming up. Play Like a Jet, Connor Long's podcast, Atlantic Flight Jets Talk podcast I'll be on. So got a lot of stuff coming up. Boy Green I'll be on after the Senior Bowl. So you'll catch me everywhere at D Tereman. And yeah, we'll just keep waiting and seeing on these GM and head coaches, because it's hard to be reactionary when we don't know the result of this process yet.
Wow, there's some great names you just brought up. Actually, all great names. Everyone who knows anything about Jets media, everyone knows who they are. So
Absolutely.
I'm absolutely thrilled to have you on my show as well. So thank you very much, Dylan, for coming on and telling us, educating us on what's going on and what goes on inside your head with regards to this fantastic team we call the Jets. But thank you, brother. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Always a pleasure. You know, I'm happy to come on. This is my second time.
Y'all know what to say. On three. 1, 2, 3.